At the end of the Second World War across Europe, there were many Allied war criminals, and those who had collaborated with the Germans and Nazi enemy who were executed. Inside of Landsberg prison, the US military condemned around 300 people who were sent crashing through the gallows structure. There was experienced British executioner Albert Pierpoint, who dealt with the brutal concentration camp guards such as Josef Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, and Irma Grazer, the hyena of Auschwitz. These were also condemned on a gallows inside of Hamlin prison. Some local governments carried out executions in public. For example, the guards of Stutthof concentration camp were hanged on huge gallows on a hill in Gdansk, and many women also were executed on this structure in front of a crowd of thousands. But inside of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, there was an execution method which was slightly different. This was known as pole hanging, and condemned people were taken up to a post where skilled executioners passed a system of ropes around them and through a pulley system at the top and bottom. When their chest sling was released, these people were condemned, and death usually occurred within a minute. There were many executions carried out in this manner, and in this lengthy video we will go through a number of the most prominent pole-hanging executions of the post-Second World War era. Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Karl Hermann Frank was born in January 1898 in Austria-Hungary, and he was taught by his father with regard to politics. His father was a proud nationalist who was angry with regards to the government, but as the First World War broke out, Frank tried to join the Austro-Hungarian army, but he was turned down because he suffered with blindness in his right eye. Because of this, he looked for a different career, and he spent a year at a law school in Prague, but he then became exposed to nationalistic policies in Germany and the ideas of the National Socialist Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. Karl Hermann Frank then joined the Nazis, and he was involved in establishing different regional bases for the party in certain areas. He opened a bookshop in 1925, and this specialised in Nazi publications and books, and Frank also became a power behind the Sudeten German Homeland Front. He would become the deputy leader of this, and he was then elected as a member of the Czechoslovak Parliament. But he was a Nazi still, and he was then, when the Germans were given the Sudetenland following the Munich Conference, made the deputy Gauleiter, or deputy regional leader, in this part of the Reich. He then officially joined the Nazi Party, and also the SS, on the 1st of November 1938. In 1939, Frank was promoted to become an SS Gruppenführer, and he was then made the Secretary of State for the Reich Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, as the Nazis seized control of the whole of Czechoslovakia. He was serving under Konstantin von Neurath, and was named the area's higher SS and police leader, meaning he was in charge of the SS and the Nazi police in this region. This meant that he controlled also the Gestapo, the SD and the Kripo, and their actions, and he was very powerful. He had a huge amount of influence in the region and control, and he would also try to suppress elements of the resistance and those who dissented against the Nazi occupation. He targeted the Prime Minister, and he was much more hard-line than Neurath, who was considered soft. Karl Hermann Frank wanted roundups, torture and execution for those who would not fall into line, and Frank would usurp Neurath and would go to Hitler, and Hitler would back Frank and would adopt a stronger approach in the region. Neurath was later sacked, and Frank wanted to be appointed as a deputy protector of Bohemia and Moravia behind Reinhard Heydrich, and Reinhard Heydrich was given the power to do whatever he wanted in the area. Heydrich would carry out public executions, and also would slaughter many civilians to bring the rest into line, as he needed to keep the region productive and to keep up their quotas for the German war effort. Frank and Heydrich would work together in this, and their relationship was a notoriously good one, but this meant more suffering for the civilian population. They would terrorise the population and killed opponents, and also deported thousands of Jews to concentration and extermination camps. Thousands were arrested, and hundreds were being executed. But Heydrich would be assassinated in 1942, and it's possible that there were plans drawn up to assassinate Frank too. But following Heydrich's death, Frank was passed over for promotion, and Kurt Daluga replaced Heydrich, and the pair would organise the razing of Czech villages, including Ledis and Lezaki, as punishment for Heydrich's death. Frank ordered an SD chief to shoot all the men and to send all women to concentration camps, and to then rip children away from their homes, and to send them to Germany for Germanisation if they were deemed worthy of it. Other children were just murdered. Further promotions came, and Frank was then appointed as a general of police in Prague, and he was also a Waffen SS general. He continued to become a feared beast, and he was the most powerful man in Bohemia and Moravia, and one of the most experienced in leadership, and he was then made the Minister of State, and was then able to attend cabinet meetings with Hitler with regards to the activities in the region. He would order further anti-partisan raids, and thousands of soldiers were then deployed in keeping the underground resistance down. They would carry out many executions, but the Germans could not destroy the partisan orders altogether, as they were too strong and they knew the areas too well. As the Nazis' empire crumbled around them, Prague stayed in control of the Nazis. It was the last major city amongst the major European ones to be freed. Karl Hermann Frank was defiant in his stance to defend the city from attackers, and on the 30th of April 1945 he made a broadcast over the radio. He said that if an uprising should occur, then he would drown anyone involved in a sea of blood, before ordering the streets to be cleared of anyone, and that the army and police should shoot anyone, including civilians, on sight. With this, the streets of Prague became a bloodbath, with many being simply executed for just leaving their homes. But at the end of the Second World War, Karl Hermann Frank was arrested by American soldiers on the 9th of May 1945. He was interrogated and processed before he would then, in 1946, be sent to Prague to stand trial for the crimes that he committed in this area. He had tried to flee, as he knew he was a wanted war criminal, and he was then represented by a Czech lawyer at his trial, which he considered a complete disgrace. He was accused of many crimes, including war crimes, and the horrific massacres he ordered after Heydrich's death, and for all of these crimes he was then sentenced to death. On the 22nd of May 1946, inside of a courtyard outside of Prague's Pankrat prison, there were thousands gathered to witness the execution of the beast who had caused so much suffering inside of Czechoslovakia. Thousands were on the streets to witness the execution of Karl Hermann Frank, and it was said that those of Ladisla's widows who were able to come, and the widows of some of the 30,000 other Czechs for whose executions Frank had been adjudged indirectly responsible, occurred the second row of seats. But there was no compassion for Karl Hermann Frank. He was dragged out to the execution post, and he wore a ragged Nazi elite guard uniform and was paraded out between two guards. He was then led onto the scaffold, and the executioner then secured his legs and chest and passed a rope around the pulley and the noose around the top of the stake. The noose was secured around his neck then, and Frank then said, "Germany will live, even if we do not live." Following this, the ropes were released and he was left hanging. It was said that the spectators watched quietly in the bright sun as Frank was executed. His body was then buried in an unmarked grave, and the hangman kept the rope used to hang him as a souvenir. But he would then lose this following a night of heavy drinking. But Karl Hermann Frank was a horrific SS man who for decades was an ardent Nazi. He was an SS man who believed the Nazis would reign supreme over Europe, and his actions in the Czech region would lead to thousands being killed and slaughtered. He was a man who showed little remorse for his crimes, and went to his execution for this.
Ferenc Szalasi was born in January 1897, and he believed that he was given power to rule from God through his mother's milk. He lived with his mother right until 1944, and he followed his father's footsteps and joined the army as a young man. He finished his studies and then went to a military academy. He finished this and then was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in 1915, and he became an officer serving in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War. He was on the front lines for 3 years, and was based on the Italian front, before he was sent to Verdun in the final days of the conflict. Following the political struggles in Hungary after the war, Szalasi was apolitical, and he was not involved in political events post-war in Hungary. He continued to train inside of the military, and he enrolled in the General Staff Officers Training at other military academies. He was seen as an outstanding officer, and it's considered that he was popular and a beloved member of the military. His fellow officers saw him as very intelligent and a very skilled commander, but others believed he was too powerful. He continued to succeed in the military and achieved the rank of a major. When Gyula Gumbos became the Prime Minister of Hungary around 1932, Szalasi became more involved in politics, and he then became obsessed with it. He was considered a fanatical right-wing nationalist who believed that Hungary should expand its borders back to former levels. It had previously had its lands reduced by around 72%, and he then wrote a pamphlet and sent it to other politicians, but because he was a soldier, he was banned from being involved in politics, and was sentenced to 20 days imprisonment, and was then expelled from the general staff. Following his release, he then served as a staff officer, but then was disillusioned with the army, and he decided to give his time to politics. He first made the Party of National Will a nationalistic party, and this was later banned for being too radical. But then Szalasi set up the Hungarian National Socialist Party in 1937, but this was also banned, but he did gather support from lower classes and workers. This party was anti-Semitic, but following the German Anschluss of Austria, Szalasi's followers became more radical, and he himself was arrested and imprisoned. But he was then proclaimed the National Socialist Arrow Party leader, which was a coalition of several right-wing groups, and this attracted a large number of people to it. It gained 30 seats in power, and then became eventually one of the biggest parties in Hungary. But when the Second World War broke out, the Arrow Cross Party was banned, and Szalasi was forced to work underground, and he did gain the backing of the Germans. But in March 1944, the Nazis occupied Hungary. Hitler launched Operation Marguerite, and in this, his soldiers were told to occupy the country, and with this he instilled the pro-German Derm Socse as the Prime Minister of Hungary. But the key thing for Szalasi was that the Arrow Cross Party was then legalised, and he was then able to attract more members to the party. But when the Prime Minister was quickly deposed, Szalasi then became an enemy of the Hungarian government, and the regent ordered his arrest. But the Germans in Szalasi had a perfect ally, and the Hungarian regent began to plan to come to peace with the Soviets and end Hungary's involvement in the Axis alliance. But the Germans then kidnapped his son and threatened to kill him unless the regent abdicated and put Ferenc Szalasi in power. A document was signed naming Szalasi as the Prime Minister, and this made the Arrow Cross Party partially in power. He was then placed as the head of the state, and then his government changed the Kingdom of Hungary into a puppet state of Nazi Germany. The Council of Regency was established and approved, and on the 4th of November 1944, Szalasi was made the leader of the nation, and he was joined in power by 16 ministers, half who belonged to his Arrow Cross Party. But whilst in power, he had very few other plans but to carry out the policies which pleased the Nazis. He executed the Nazi Party's beliefs and ideology, and he did this to please Hitler and to stop the Germans being a threat. Along with the Nazis, Szalasi's government recommended the deportation of the Jews which had been paused. His government promoted martial law, and they carried out large-scale executions of those who were considered possible enemies of Szalasi and his party. He also deported thousands of Jews, and many were executed and killed inside of the gas chambers, and despite not being in power for long, in particular 163 days, he had a devastating and deadly effect. He also sent large amounts of Hungarian produce and resources to Germany to help with their war effort, and he forced young and old men into the last remnants of the Hungarian army, being forced to fight the Soviet war machine of the Red Army. When he took control of the country, the Red Army were inside of Hungary, and his authority was rather limited, but his party did deport 80,000 people to the concentration camps. But on the 19th of November 1944, he had nowhere to go, as he was inside Budapest as it was encircled by the Soviet Red Army, and also the Romanian army, as they surrounded the city. This resulted in a 102-day siege of Budapest, but as it took hold, he managed to escape and flee. He fled to a city in the west of Hungary, then carried on to Vienna in March 1945, and then he went to Munich. But as Hungary capitulated and fell to the Soviets, the cabinet of the Arrow Cross Party had fled the lands, and it was dissolved on the 7th of May 1945, the day before Germany surrendered. But on the 6th of May, the day before, Ferenc Szalasi was captured by the Americans, and months later was repatriated back to Hungary. The Hungarians then tried him by the People's Tribunal in Budapest, and many open sessions took place where war criminals were sentenced to death and were executed for high treason. Ferenc Szalasi was placed on trial for high treason but also war crimes, and he was deemed guilty of deporting thousands of his own people to their deaths in concentration camps. He was virtually hated by the Hungarian people, and on the 12th of March 1946 he was brought to Budapest in a town square where he was to be executed. Along with two of his former ministers and a party theologist, the group of the Arrow Cross members were then led to where a number of large posts had been placed. The method of execution for Ferenc Szalasi was hanging using the Austrian pole method, and a few large posts had been set up with a rope attached to a hook at the top. Szalasi was taken up to the scaffold, and he was then flanked by guards, and members of the public watched on. He was placed with his back to the post, and his arms and legs were tied up so he could not move. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the rope was then tightened, before the executioner took the steps from underneath him. He had been given the last rites before, but the post only left a couple of feet between the hanging man and the ground, and this method of execution in particular led to him slowly strangling to death, rather than having his neck snapped. He struggled and strangled, but then he succumbed to his death shortly after, whilst the public looked on. He was then buried in a new public cemetery in Budapest, but Ferenc Szalasi was considered a serious war criminal inside of Hungary, despite only being in office and power from the 16th of October 1944 to the 28th of March 1945. Despite initially being a military officer, he entered politics and crafted his right-wing ideas. But Szalasi became a man whose party were involved in collaborating with the Nazis in their politics and beliefs, which resulted in the mass murder and brutality of people and their deaths inside of the concentration camps. But he was executed in front of a huge crowd in Budapest. After the end of the war, inside of Hungary, there were many executions that took place outside the Academy of Music in Budapest. This building became synonymous with the executions of former politicians who had plunged the country into a tragic and terrible war that saw the land closely allied with the Nazis. Hungarians would fight alongside German soldiers, and they would be rocked by huge deportations of people from their lands to concentration camps. The truth was that there were many politicians who became Prime Minister quickly and came within power, and they collaborated with the Nazis and with Hitler and Mussolini, and after the war, a number of these politicians, including Belarin Rady, were executed in Budapest, outside the Academy of Music. Thousands would flock to witness these executions, and to see what they believed justice being carried out. However, what is the story of the woman who was executed inside of Budapest, in the same place it's believed as the former Prime Ministers? Maria or Manci Nagy was a World War II criminal who had been taken to a People's Tribunal or trial. These were held to deal with those who were accused of crimes against humanity and of causing huge suffering inside concentration camps. Those members of the army who committed atrocities were also tried in this way, and following her trial, Maria or Manci was then condemned to death. But what did she do? It's believed that as she was a Second World War war criminal, she was known for torturing young Jewish women. This leads to the possibility that she was actually a woman who worked inside of the concentration camps. There were many women who became guards for the SS inside of camps within the Third Reich, such as Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, and a number of them were condemned for their crimes. But usually women like Irma Grazer were executed in private within prison cells and execution chambers, well away from the eyes of the public. The name associated with the condemned woman, Manci, is short for Margaret in Hungary, and what is strange is that little documented evidence, except from pictures and photographs, remain regarding her fate and execution. She is considered an unknown war criminal, and from the images it's clear that she is a woman who was rather elderly. She looks rather respectable and is wrapped in a sweater, but looks petrified as she makes her way to her execution. But there is another possibility as to why she was executed. In the final days of the Second World War in Hungary, there was large-scale killing and looting as the Soviet Red Army invaded and took city after city before moving to Budapest. It's possible that Mansi was one of those who stole the property of displaced people, or that she attacked women who were already suffering. For her to be sentenced to death, it's clear she must have done something that was very, very serious. She could also have been someone who was a collaborator with the Germans and who passed information on to the Nazis, the Gestapo or the SS about possibly the locations of Jewish women or prisoners. There were people who were paid to hunt Jews across Europe, and they acted off tip-offs from neighbours and local people to do this. Perhaps Mansi was one of those collaborators who were considered the lowest of the low inside of society. In Holland, there was one young woman who was executed for this crime, but she was deemed to have been a war criminal on the same level as the SS, who were deporting Jews to concentration camps. She was willingly giving over Jews to the enemy, and they would then be exterminated as soon as they arrived at sites such as Auschwitz. For Mansi Nagy to be executed in front of a crowd inside of Budapest, her offence and crime must have been incredibly serious and also shocking. The witnesses that day would have known that they were seeing the death of a war criminal. The events of her execution were in keeping with the executions of prominent Hungarians throughout the war. She was led out from her prison and was taken to an execution post and would be executed using the pole hanging method. With this, a noose was attached to a pole or a large wooden stake through a hook, which was then fed through an eyelet to the executioner, who was stood behind the condemned. When the wooden plank someone was standing on was removed, the executioner would pull on the noose and strangle the condemned against the pole. Death usually occurred in a few minutes. Maria or Mansi Nagy was accompanied by a priest who remained with her for her final moments, and the preparations for her execution were done by the executioner, who was wearing a suit and a hat, and also his assistants who helped him. These two, it's quite clear, were also the ones who performed the killing, and she would not be alone in her final moments. On the pole next to her was a white sheet in which a previously executed person was covered up in their final moments. This person would have been executed minutes before, and their body was then kept out of view of Mansi as she approached the stake. With her legs tied and her arms tied and the rope passed around her middle, she then climbed on top of the wooden box or step as the executioner fastened the noose and the rope around her neck. The step was then removed and she was left, and within minutes she was executed by the executioner. The story of Mansi or Maria Nagy is one which is shocking. What did this elderly woman do that was so offensive and evil that she would be taken in front of a crowd in Budapest and would be executed in public? Judging by the shape of the windows and the brickwork behind her, the execution must have occurred outside the Academy of Music, where former ministers and politicians were also executed. These sometimes were executed by firing squad, however. Former Prime Minister Ferenc Szalasi, who was one who was considered one of the country's worst war criminals, would be executed on the same stakes and in the same manner as this elderly woman. It's believed that she did and would have collaborated with the Nazis and Germans, and may have given up Jewish women who were hiding out, and they were then taken to extermination centres and were killed. But the sight of the elderly lady making her way to her death is one which has still puzzled historians, as we do not know too much about her crime. But the ageing lady in her sweater, in the eyes of the Hungarian officials and the witnesses and the people of Budapest, must at the time have deserved her execution for whatever she did. Kurt Deluga was born on the 15th of September 1897, and little is known about his early life. But when he was a young man, he joined the Prussian army and saw action in the First World War. He served on the Eastern Front and rose throughout the ranks quickly and became an officer, but then he was moved over to the Western Front. However, Deluga did sustain a bad injury to the shoulder and head, and it was claimed in hospital that he was 25% disabled and at the end of the conflict he was decorated for his bravery, and then he found work as an engineer. But after his experiences in the war, Kurt Deluga then sought to join a number of political groups as he was not happy with the post-war Germany. He joined the Upper Silesian Self-Defense and was their leader, this being a group of World War I veterans who came into conflict with Polish people, but he was also a member of the Freikorps, who were angry with the Weimar Republic government. It was around this time that Adolf Hitler then began to conduct a number of speeches for the Nazi Party, and he rose to gain more popularity. But in 1923 Deluga joined the Nazi Party officially, and he would not be put off following the failed efforts of Hitler during the Munich Putsch. He then joined the Berlin Front, which was a detachment of SA members who had been outlawed following the failed revolution. However, Deluga then rose to become the leader of the SA detachments in Berlin, after in 1926 the banning was over. He began to rub shoulders with the Nazi hierarchy, and was a deputy for Joseph Goebbels, the Gauleiter of Berlin, and was seen as a reliable official, and Hitler also valued him. He was advised to join the SS and leave the SA behind him, which was a good piece of advice, as the Night of the Long Knives would see a huge purge of the SA, with leaders such as Deluga targeted for execution. But Deluga would be involved in hostilities between the SA and the SS, and he was seen as a reliable man with inside knowledge who could help keep them in line. Deluga helped to defend Berlin's party headquarters of the Nazis, and Hitler even celebrated Deluga's efforts. He wrote in an open letter saying, "SS man, your honour is loyalty, my honour is loyalty." But he was promoted and Heinrich Himmler was in control of the southern units of the SS, with Deluga in control of the northern units. Himmler would eventually rise to become the Reichsführer SS and the head of the group, and one of the most powerful men in Germany behind Adolf Hitler, but Deluga is much less known about. He continued to establish his power, and he became a member of the Reichstag, and also oversaw the non-political police. But Deluga during the Night of the Long Knives would also be ruthless against his former friends and allies, and he helped the police to become a Nazi police with their ideology and political beliefs instilled into the officers. Further power and influence came, then Himmler appointed Deluga as the chief of the Orpo, or the Order Police, and he was now in control of all of the uniformed police officers under the Nazi-controlled lands. Around 1939, with the outbreak of the Second World War, he had control of around 120,000 police officers, and many of these were virulent and brutal Nazis, intent on keeping people down and against dissenting against the Nazi regime. But as the Second World War continued, he was involved in some of the horrific war crimes and executions inside of occupied lands. He personally witnessed a number of mass shootings of Jews in Poland and Belarus, and he also helped to organise large-scale deportations. Deluga's signature was also present on a number of orders for people to be sent to concentration camps and also to be moved into ghettos, and he also witnessed much of the senior Nazi meetings in which they discussed the expansion of the Holocaust. But inside of Czechoslovakia, Deluga became a brutal and barbaric overseer. Following the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, Deluga was named Deputy Protector in 1942. A state of emergency occurred following this, and dozens of people were executed in reprisal. It was decided that the revenge attacks would be centred on a number of villages, and those who it was believed had helped to hide the assassins of Heydrich. The Nazis would execute all adult men, deport the women to the concentration camps, and send those children who they believed were suitable to SS families, and they would then burn down the villages to the ground. Deluga was a man who ordered the SS officers to assault the villages of Lidice and Lazaki. The chaos in the villages occurred, and it was horrific, and all of the men of Lidice were rounded up and taken to a farm. Mattresses were taken from the homes and were put up against the wall of the barn to stop bullets ricocheting. Then the shooting occurred at 7 a.m. on the 10th of June 1942, and groups of 5 men were brought in at a time for their execution. This was then said to have been too slow, so groups of 10 were then executed together. Only 3 male villagers survived, and 203 women and 105 children were moved to a nearby school. Children were ripped away from their mothers, who were then placed on vehicles and taken to concentration camps. But a lot of the children who were not said to have been suitable to be Germanised were then sent to the Chelmno extermination camp, where over 80 were slaughtered in gas vans. The villages were burned to the ground and destroyed with explosives, and all animals were also slaughtered. Gold teeth were even ripped from the deceased victims, and Lazaki experienced the same treatment as Ladis weeks later after a radio transmitter was found nearby, and this had allegedly been used by Heydrich's assassins. Deluga, though, terrorised the Czech people, and he was a man who could carry out the brutal will of Adolf Hitler. He continued in these roles he had until May 1943, and then he suffered a huge heart attack and almost died. He spent a long time recovering, and Hitler relieved him of his jobs and offices, and he was even given a large property to recover at by Hitler. But at the end of the Second World War, Kurt Deluga was arrested by British forces in Lubeck. He was transported first to Luxembourg and was then moved again to Czechoslovakia to face up to his crimes that he had inflicted upon the Czech people when he served as a protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was brought to trial for his crimes against humanity, and at trial he was ignorant, and it was claimed that 3 million police officers were loyal to him and saw him as a powerful figure like Heinrich Himmler. But Deluga, when accused of the charges, said he was just following the orders given to him from Hitler, and he was ignorant, saying he committed no crime. But then he was sentenced to death, and he was convicted of all of the charges. The day after he was found guilty, Kurt Deluga was executed. He was taken and held inside of Pankrak prison briefly in Prague, and during the war this had been a Gestapo interrogation centre. He was taken out of his prison cell and into the courtyard, and there were hundreds of people who had gathered in the prison courtyard to witness the death and execution of Deluga. The crowd was made up of many other guards too, and Deluga was led out by some to the execution post or pole, and he was then to be executed using the pole hanging method. He did not die on the gallows or the trapdoor, and the method would see Deluga secured to a post using ropes, which were passed through a pulley at the bottom of the pole. Deluga was then hoisted up to the top of the pole by a sling across his chest, and a noose was placed around his neck. Then the chest sling was released from around Deluga's body, and he then plunged and jerked downwards, and his head was guided down by the executioner's hands, and he dislocated Deluga's neck. There was a huge crowd that witnessed Deluga's execution, and his death was performed very efficiently. Within minutes of being handed over to the executioner, he was pronounced dead. Kurt Deluga was one of the most brutal and ruthless Nazis of the Second World War, and he was a man who was well thought of by Adolf Hitler. He had a huge amount of power as he presided over more than 100,000 police officers as the head of the Order Police, but inside of Czechoslovakia he reigned over the lands with brutality and terror, and was responsible for a number of horrific war crimes, and for these actions he would be executed inside the courtyard of Pankrak prison. Andras Kun was born on the 8th of November 1911, and as a young man he attended a seminary in Rome. He would train then as a priest in a Franciscan monastery, and it was clear he was a very devoted and religious young man. However, this Hungarian priest would then in 1943 for some reason be expelled from the monastery, and he then went back to Hungary, and he moved to Budapest. He had in the past given many different sermons and masses, and he would preach inside of the churches in Hungary. However, he would then become more politically motivated once he was back in Hungary. In 1944, Andras became a member of the pro-Nazi Arrow Cross Party, and this was a far-right ultranationalist party led by Ferenc Szalasi, and they would be involved in the government from October 1944 to March 1945. During its short time in power, they would slaughter between 10 to 15,000 civilians, including many Jews, and it's believed that they deported around 80,000 people from the country to concentration camps. The Arrow Cross Party's beliefs were very similar to the Nazis and the fascists. They were very anti-Semitic. Before the German invasion of Hungary in March 1944, Kun decided to devote his time to the Arrow Cross Party, and he would then take part in the seizure of power, and he would be involved in distributing weapons to other members. He said that the propaganda drilled into us the belief that the Jews lurk behind the Bolsheviks. Amidst the wildest battles I stood with this conviction, and as Jews came before me I beat them. The Germans would help the Arrow Cross Party gain power, as they took Regent Horthy into protective custody and forced him to abdicate. Szalasi was then made the leader of the Hungarian nation and the Prime Minister of the government. The Arrow Cross rule would be brutal, with mass slaughter occurring across the nation, despite the fact that the Soviets were already within Hungarian borders and were fighting the Germans. Adolf Eichmann worked with the officers of the party to restart deportations of Jews from Budapest, and most of them were sent to camps such as Auschwitz and were exterminated as soon as they got there. The Arrow Cross Party and the SS would continue to exterminate the Jews of Hungary, and deportations continued, as well as using death squads, who would attack in the war zones similarly to how the Einsatzgruppen would slaughter civilians following military advances. Andras Kun then commanded an Arrow Cross detachment death squad in a district of Budapest, following Ferenc Szalasi leaving Budapest as he believed the city would be besieged by the Soviet Red Army. Andras's death squad would then slaughter and massacre Jews or any civilian who were hiding. During these attacks, he would often dress in priest robes and his cassock, as well as his Roman collar, showing that he was a priest. He would then wear his Arrow Cross armband and his holstered pistol. He would then order his soldiers in the name of Christ fire, claiming that he was doing God's bidding, slaughtering dozens of innocent people. He would later say, "I always wanted to reduce human misery and suffering. This is why I fought against the Jews. They are the lords of capital. The Jews were always the ones to walk on the sunny side of the street." In January 1945, he ordered the arrest of a well-known Jewish author and his family, and Kun and his executioners then tortured his son and wife. They were then taken to the Arrow Cross headquarters, where they were stripped and tied together and beaten. Around midnight they faced the firing squad, but amazingly their son survived 4 bullets and later made it out of Hungary. On the 12th of January 1945, Kun's death squad broke into a Jewish hospital in Maros Street, and 149 patients and doctors were then shot by him and his men. He then went to another hospital and shot another 100 dead. His death squad also entered sheltered housing and abducted 500 Jews, who were all lined up on the banks of the Danube River before Kun gave the order to shoot. Further attacks took place when the men broke into a sanatorium, slaughtering 100 more. When the siege of Budapest occurred, he did not flee the city, but continued to attack and massacre. Many of the bridges were exploded to prevent escape, and Kun helped a lot of war criminals escape to Buda, and he then continued to carry out his brutal actions. But even the Arrow Cross government officials became fed up with his crimes, as he would attack buildings under their protection of neutral countries, and on the 18th of January 1945, a police patrol was ordered to arrest him. But Andras then turned the tables on them, and he arrested the police, and beat their commanders terribly and locked them in a basement. His headquarters were then surrounded, and it was said if he did not give himself up in 10 minutes, the authorities would attack the building. Andras Kun handed himself over, and for 3 months he had rampaged across Budapest. Andras Kun had been arrested, and he was then brought to trial. The National Calling of Account Department charged him with specific crimes. One said that, on the 18th of January 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Rezo Mindak was severely beaten and later arrested, and Kun abused a section of police officers in the party house. He was then accused of being involved in the murders of around 3,000 people, but this was all going on whilst the Second World War was still waging on. He would be spared from execution during the war initially by Ferenc Szalasi, who commuted his sentence to 15 years in prison, but then when the Soviets captured the city, Andras Kun was released from prison by the guards as they did not know the monster that he was. He went missing for some months, and it's believed pretended to be Romanian, and he then left the scene of his crimes to travel on to Italy, possibly to pick up the priesthood again. But then on the Hungarian side of the Italian border, he was captured on the 3rd of August 1945, and the border guard transported him back to Budapest around 4 weeks later to stand trial, yet again for his crimes. He was brought in front of the Hungarian People's Tribunal, and he was then tried for the murder of 500 people. The true death toll of Andras Kun and his death squad it's believed is more, but let's not forget that in the years during the war, he was a priest. He was tried and was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as the slaughter and massacre of innocent people during the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen. He was interviewed on the day of his execution, and he would state when accused of sadism, "This perversion exists in a dormant state in every soul." When asked if it existed in his soul as well, Kun responded, "If it did, then it was dormant. I was not conscious of it." He would also admit in interviews that he did beat the Jews, but he continued to deny that he ever killed anyone, and he said he would be wrongly sentenced to death. He even claimed that he was a victim. However, on the 19th of September 1945, he was brought to Budapest for his execution. He was executed by the pole hanging method, and and was brought to the stake inside the city and was led up to the step. He had a rope passed around his body and his arms and legs were secured, before an executioner who was stood on a ladder secured a noose around his neck. Minutes later, as the crowd looked on through windows, the drop was released, and in minutes the killer priest of Budapest was executed, bringing his reign of terror to an end. It is not every day that you write a video on a killer priest who executed and slaughtered hundreds of people, leading a death squad. Andras Kun was a brutal and barbaric man who was involved in the massacres of many people, as a government supported by Hitler took control in Hungary. Even when they fell from power, Andras would go on the rampage. He was a man who was sick and twisted, and was a terrible war criminal, who was taken to an execution stake for his crimes. Lajos Andre was born on the 1st of January 1895, and he was born into a very wealthy family. But he would then go to university to study political science following a period in service in the Austro-Hungarian army. He saw service on the Western Front, but then after defeating the army, he became a local government officer. But Andre was then involved in the right-wing nationalist movement known as MOVE. But he then developed a reputation for brutality and for being incredibly cruel, and he then wormed his way into a role inside of the Hungarian National Socialist Party, and he would be involved in recruitment and organising movements for the party. This political group was of course inspired in a sense by the Nazi Party, and despite just being a minor party in the country before the war broke out, it did attract a significant degree of supporters, and they were also brutally anti-Semitic, and they encouraged the persecutions of other people. However, in 1938, he became part of the government and governing party of Bela Imredi. Imredi had begun his career in politics as pro-British, but then, after a number of high-profile resignations and sackings, he was made the Prime Minister of Hungary. But soon Imredi realised he was upsetting Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, the dictators of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. They saw him as an enemy to begin with, but then Imredi realised that he needed to please these two nations, and he started to move his government and country closer to the ideas of the Nazis. He would realise that Hungary could be helped financially by these two also, and his government then began to harass other opposition and opponents in brutal ways. But Imredi would be shockingly ousted from power after being in office for less than a year, as his opponents went to the Hungarian regent with claims that his great-grandfather was in fact Jewish, and Imredi was accused of being a hypocrite, as he was persecuting Jews inside of his country, and he was then forced to step down. But inside of Imredi's government, right-wing figures such as Lajos Andre were given positions and platforms of influence, and Andre became one of the leading anti-Semitic voices that the Prime Minister would listen to on a regular basis. He believed that the Hungarian government's anti-Jewish laws and the persecution they were involved in was not strong enough, and he favoured the laws that the Nazis had and wanted them introducing to Hungary. He managed to push through his agenda, and he was responsible for further laws that placed more restrictions on Jews. His laws banned them from visiting beaches and spas, and also banned Jewish people from working at fairs and making money, but his laws would later be reversed when they briefly fell from power. But still, as the Second World War was going on, Lajos Andre was not a major figure in government, and he was in a sense working in the shadows. But his rise to power came later, in 1944, as Hitler, who was fed up of Hungary's hesitancy to become fully behind the German war effort, ordered a huge invasion and occupation of Hungary. Hungarian units had suffered heavily during the Battle of Stalingrad, and following this the regent realised that the Germans would probably lose the war. There were talks of a separate armistice being agreed for Hungary and the Western Allies, but to prevent this happening, Hitler got wind of this and ordered the occupation. The Nazis now occupied the country, and if there wasn't a reason for people to fear for their lives before, it was now a real possibility that terror would come to their lives and their streets. The Nazi occupiers got rid of a tolerant government, headed up by Prime Minister Miklos Kalas, and they then forced the regent to replace him with a Nazi sympathiser. But the Nazis wanted the new rulers in Hungary to be on their side, and the Nazis also prioritised the final solution inside of the country. They wanted the quick extermination of the country's Jews, who had been suffering through persecution. Lajos Andre was viewed by the Nazis as an expert on this matter, and he was very anti-Semitic. He was appointed the State Secretary in the Minister of the Interior, in the Nazi-controlled government under the Interior Minister Andor Jaros. However, Andre, despite being a number 2, would be given huge and shocking powers to cause mass suffering. He was able to put thousands of people into established ghettos and then deport hundreds of thousands of Jews out of the country to concentration camps. He was a man who helped Adolf Eichmann deport over 400,000 Hungarian Jews between May and July 1944. The majority of these were then sent to Auschwitz, where Operation Hearst was enacted, and these people were then gassed in 56 murderous days at the site. The Hungarian Jews killed in this quick spate amassed to around half of all those who were killed at Auschwitz, the largest concentration camp of the Second World War. But Andre's brutality was wide-reaching, and the regent Miklos Horthy learned of this, and he then ordered his sacking from the Interior Ministry, and he was disgusted with his involvement in the deportations. The regent would bring these to an end, but Andre was then sacked, but within a month he came back to government. The Nazis were ousted from the country as the Soviet Union approached, and Andre was then appointed as the Commissioner of Civil Administration, with Ferenc Szalasi's Arrow Cross Party rising to power. But then in March 1945, Budapest would crumble to the Red Army, as they brought war to the doorsteps of the Hungarian capital. Andre knew he would be sought after, and he knew he would be a wanted man, and because of this he fled to Austria, hoping to escape justice, but he was later captured and was then extradited back to his nation for punishment by his own people. In December 1943, months after the Second World War had come to an end, Laszlo Andre was brought to trial in Budapest, and he was accused of crimes against humanity and in being a collaborator with the Nazis. It did not take long until he was found guilty of the murder of the Jews and of acting against the national interests of Hungary. For this he was sentenced to death, and there were a number of politicians who were also condemned. But he was to be executed with the Austro-Hungarian pole hanging method, and this was where the condemned stood in front of a pole, which was 3 metres high. Then ropes and pulleys were attached to their feet, and the rope would be passed around the body and through loops around the prisoner's neck, and a chest sling would then be released, and the condemned person would then be left hanging. Laszlo Andre was flanked by guards who brought him to his pole, along with another man, and the ropes were then secured and a white cap was placed over his head before the rope was dropped and he was left hanging. Within minutes, he was dead. Laszlo Andre was a Hungarian politician who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people who were sent to camps such as Auschwitz. He was a very evil man, whose actions would condemn many people inside of the worst hells on earth. But he was a man who was in league with the terrible members of the SS, and he was considered an architect of the mass slaughter of innocent people. But inside of Budapest, in front of a sizable crowd, this former politician was executed for his crimes. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.